Welcome back to Marginal Thoughts. Ever see those headlines about government debt? Trillions and trillions of dollars.
Oh, yeah. They definitely grab your attention.
You just kind of think, how is that even possible? And
Yeah.
why does it just keep going up? It feels we're huge.
It does. It sounds quite alarming, honestly. But
Yeah.
when you look into it, it turns out pretty much every country has debt, even the really wealthy ones.
Right. We were looking into this, and yeah, places like Germany, Switzerland, even Qatar, they've all got debt. And Japan, its debt is like twice its whole economy.
It is. And the U.S. is sitting around, what, $36 trillion now? It's a staggering figure.
It really makes you stop and wonder, why? Why do countries borrow so much? Why not just, I don't know, print the money they need?
That's a great question. And if everyone's borrowing, who's doing all the lending?
Exactly. Those are the kinds of big questions we want to tackle today. We're going to try and make sense of it, even if this is something totally new to you.
Okay, let's do it. Maybe start with the absolute basics. Like, what even is national debt?
Good idea. Lay it out for us.
Well, the simplest way to put it is it's the total sum of money that a country's central government owes.
Okay, so kind of like a giant government credit card tally.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. It's basically all the past borrowing added up when the government spent more than it collected in taxes over the years.
And you said central government. So this isn't debt from like the state of California or New York City or my personal student loan.
No, exactly. That's a really key point. National debt is strictly the federal government's borrowing. It doesn't count state or local debt, and definitely not private debt like mortgages or credit cards.
Got it. So it's the big overarching number for the country itself.
Right. Governments borrow when their spending outstrips their income, mostly from taxes. Just like, an individual might borrow for a house.
But on a much, much bigger scale.
A much bigger scale, yes. And they don't just borrow from one bank, they borrow from, well, lots of different sources.
Okay, so that covers the what, but the part that still kind of twists my brain is the why. Why borrow? Seriously, why not just fire up the printing presses?
The printing money question.
Yeah.
It comes up a lot, and there's a very, very important reason they don't just do that. Inflation. Or potentially hyperinflation.
Okay, I've heard that term. What actually happens? Why is printing money bad?
Well, if the government just creates a ton of new money, but the amount of stuff to buy in the economy, goods and services, hadn't increased.
Then you just have more money chasing the same amount of stuff.
Exactly. And that pushes prices up, sometimes really, really fast.
That's the hyperinflation thing, where money basically becomes worthless wallpaper.
Precisely. We've seen it happen in places like Venezuela, Zimbabwe. It can wreck an economy. So borrowing, perhaps surprisingly, actually introduces some discipline.
How so?
Because debt typically comes with interest. You have to pay it back. That forces some level of fiscal responsibility, hopefully.
Okay, so avoiding economic meltdown is reason number one. What are the other big reasons countries borrow?
Well, the most common one is just covering budget deficits year to year,
Meaning the government plans to spend more than it expects to take in through taxes that year?
Yeah. Governments budget for everything. Education, healthcare, roads, military, social programs, you name it. Sometimes the planned spending is just higher than the projected revenue.
So they have a gap.
Right. Say they figure they'll collect $3 trillion in taxes, but need $4 trillion for everything. That's a $1 trillion deficit for the year. They could cut spending.
Which means cutting services people depend on. Not popular.
Or they could raise taxes.
Also not popular.
Exactly. So borrowing is often the quickest, maybe politically easiest way to fill that gap right then and there.
Okay, so it keeps the lights on, basically. What else? Is it just about covering shortfalls?
No, not always. Debt can also be used for investment, big long-term investments in the country's future.
Like what kind of things?
Building major infrastructure. Think highways, airports, high-speed rail, upgrading the power grid, new schools, research facilities, hospitals, things that cost a lot up front.
Stuff you can't just pay for out of one year's taxes easily.
Right. Instead of saving up for decades, borrowing lets them build these things now, which means people benefit sooner. And, importantly, these kinds of investments can actually boost economic growth down the line.
How does that work?
Well, better roads mean goods move faster. Better schools mean a more skilled workforce. Better infrastructure attracts business. It can lead to more economic activity, more jobs, and eventually more tax revenue, which can help pay down the debt. So it can be an investment in future repayment capacity.
Okay, that makes sense. Using debt to grow. What about sudden shocks, like unexpected stuff?
That's another huge reason. Handling crises. Sometimes you just don't have a choice. Think about wars or massive natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, or, a global pandemic.
Like COVID-19.
Yes, exactly. In 2020, the U.S. government had to spend enormous amounts very quickly on things like relief payments, extra unemployment benefits, support for businesses, healthcare. The borrowing was huge, something like $3.8 trillion just for that, about 18% of the whole economy's output that year.
Wow. That's immense.
It is. But without that borrowing, the economic damage from the pandemic, job losses, business failures could have been far, far worse. So in emergencies, borrowing can be absolutely essential to prevent a total collapse.
So it's like an emergency fund, but you borrow it when you need it. Are there other reasons?
Yeah, sometimes governments borrow new money just to pay back old loans that are coming due.
Wait, so they borrow to pay back previous borrowing?
hmm It's kind of like refinancing a mortgage. Maybe interest rates are lower now so they can replace old expensive debt with new cheaper debt, or maybe a large chunk of old debt is simply maturing and they don't have the cash on hand to pay the whole principal back at once.
Is that okay? Does that work?
It can be a normal part of managing debt, if done prudently, but it's also where things can get risky. If a country gets stuck in a loop where it has to keep borrowing just to make interest payments on its existing debt, that's how you fall into a debt trap.
Like Sri Lanka recently, they defaulted. Yeah.
Exactly. That's an example of what can happen when managing the refinancing or the overall debt burden goes wrong.
Okay, scary. One more reason.
Yeah, sometimes borrowing, or more specifically, issuing government bonds, is used as a tool for managing the wider economy.
How does that work?
Well, when the government sells bonds, people and institutions use their money to buy them. That takes money out of circulation, which can help manage inflation. The central bank's actions involving government debt also influence interest rates across the economy. So it's not just about the government needing cash, it's also a lever they can pull to influence economic conditions.
Oh, that's actually pretty interesting. It's a tool for steering the economy, too.
It can be, yes. It's
Oh.
complex.
Okay, so we've got the what and the why. But this brings up that other huge question. If countries are borrowing trillions, who on earth has that kind of money to lend out? Who are they borrowing from?
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. It's definitely not just one big bank somewhere. The lenders fall into roughly three main groups.
Okay, lay 'em on me. Group one.
Domestic lenders. These are lenders inside the country itself.
Like regular people. Can I lend money to the government?
You absolutely can. Usually by buying government bonds, savings bonds, treasury bonds, things like that. When you buy a bond, you're essentially lending the government money for a set period, and they promise to pay you back with interest.
Okay. But is it mostly individuals?
Individuals are part of it, but the really big domestic lenders are typically institutions. Think local banks, big investment funds, pension funds managing retirement money for millions of people, insurance companies.
Okay, so large financial players within the country.
And this is a big one, even other parts of the government itself.
Wait, the government lends money to itself? How does that work?
It sounds weird, right? But yeah, it's called intragovernmental debt. Take the U.S. Social Security system, for example. It collects payroll taxes, but it doesn't pay all that money out immediately. The surplus gets invested in special government bonds.
So Social Security is essentially lending its extra cash to the Treasury.
Exactly, to keep it safe and earn some interest. And it's a huge amount. In early 2025, this kind of debt held by government accounts was around $7.3 trillion in the U.S. So a big chunk of the national debt is money the government technically owes to these internal trust funds.
Wow, okay. That's not what I expected. So domestic lenders, individuals, banks, funds, and other government agencies. What's group two?
Foreign lenders. This is probably what most people think of. It includes individuals, companies, and banks in other countries. But a very large portion is other governments.
So like China lending money to the U.S.
Yes, that's a classic example. Foreign governments buy U.S. Treasury bonds and bonds from other stable countries, often as a way to invest their foreign currency reserves. They see it as a relatively safe investment that pays some interest.
Who are the biggest foreign holders of U.S. debt?
Traditionally, countries like Japan and China have been major holders. Each holds, hundreds of billions, sometimes over $1 trillion worth of U.S. debt.
So for them, it's just a safe place to park money.
For stable economies like the U.S., generally yes. But what about countries that are seen as riskier? Foreign governments might be less willing to just buy their bonds on the open market.
So what happens then? Do they get loans from somewhere else?
They might seek loans from international institutions, like the World Bank,
Right.
which often lends for specific development projects, maybe at lower interest rates, but with conditions on how the money's used.
Mm.
Or if a country is in a serious crisis, they might turn to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
Ah, yes, the IMF, they give bailout loans,
They
right?
provide emergency financing to prevent economic collapse, yes.
Mm.
But those loans usually come with pretty strict conditions attached.
What kind of conditions?
Things often called structural adjustments. They might require the borrowing country to cut government spending sharply, raise taxes, sell off state-owned companies, devalue their currency. Things aimed at stabilizing the economy and ensuring the IMF gets repaid.
That sounds tough. For the people living there, I mean.
It can be extremely difficult. These austerity measures can lead to job losses, cuts in public services, and higher costs for basic goods, at least in the short term. We've seen significant social unrest and protests in countries like Greece or Argentina following IMF programs. It's often very controversial.
Okay, so domestic lenders, foreign lenders, governments and institutions like the IMF. What's the third group?
The country's own central bank, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. or the Bank of England in the U.K.
So the Fed can just buy government debt. Isn't that like the printing money problem we talked about?
That's the nuance. If the central bank bought bonds directly from the Treasury when the government needed money, yes, that would be very close to just creating money out of thin air to fund spending, risking inflation. So that's generally avoided or heavily restricted.
So how do they get involved then?
They typically buy government bonds indirectly on the secondary market, meaning they buy bonds that are already out there, usually from commercial banks or other financial institutions.
And why do they do that?
It's usually part of their job managing the overall economy, what's called monetary policy. By buying bonds, they inject money into the banking system, which can lower interest rates and encourage lending and economic activity, or they might sell bonds to pull money out and cool things down. It's more about influencing the financial system and less about directly bankrolling the government's day-to-day spending.
I see. So it's an economic management tool, not just a direct funding mechanism.
Primarily, yes,
Oh.
though obviously their actions affect how easily and cheaply the government can borrow.
Okay, this is making more sense. We know what debt is, why governments borrow, and who they borrow from. But let's circle back to those massive numbers. $36 trillion. Japan owing double its economy. It just sounds bad. Is national debt automatically a terrible thing?
That's probably the most important question, and the answer is, well, it's complicated. It's not inherently bad, no. Think of it like that double-edged sword again.
Okay. Explain the two edges. What's the good side?
When debt is used wisely, borrowing to invest in infrastructure that genuinely boosts long-term economic growth, or borrowing to provide essential support during a major crisis like a pandemic or war, it can absolutely be beneficial. It can help the country grow faster, create jobs, and improve living standards. As long as the economy is healthy enough to handle the debt payments, a certain level of debt is perfectly manageable, even productive.
So the good edge is using it for productive investments or critical emergencies. What's the bad edge?
The danger comes when the debt grows too large compared to the size of the economy, especially if the country is borrowing just to pay its routine bills, or, worse, just to pay interest on old debt. That's the debt trap scenario we mentioned.
What happens then?
If interest payments start eating up a huge chunk of the government's budget, there's less money left for everything else: healthcare, education, defense, roads. It can stifle public services and investment.
And what if the lenders, those domestic and foreign buyers of bonds, start to worry?
If lenders lose confidence in a country's ability or willingness to pay back its debt, they'll demand higher interest rates to lend it money in the future. It becomes more expensive to borrow.
Like a bad credit score for a country.
Exactly. Countries have credit ratings too, from agencies like Moody's or S&P. If a country's rating gets downgraded, its borrowing costs go up. In severe cases, it might find it almost impossible to borrow new money, leading to a full-blown debt crisis, potentially ending in default.
Like Sri Lanka or Greece years ago?
Yeah, precisely. Defaulting means they just can't make their payments. That has devastating consequences for the country's economy, its access to global markets, and its people.
Is there like a red line, a specific number where debt becomes too much?
Unfortunately, no. There's no magic number. Economists often look at the debt-to-GDP ratio, the total debt compared to the annual economic output. A ratio of, say, 60% used to be talked about as a sort of prudent level.
But you said Japan is over 200% and the U.S. over 120%.
Right. Many developed countries are way above that old benchmark now. Whether a high ratio is sustainable depends on a lot of other things.
Like what?
Like how fast the economy is growing, what the interest rates are on the debt. Is the debt mostly owed internally or externally? Does the country borrow in its own currency that it controls? A strong, stable economy that borrows in its own currency, like the US or Japan, can generally handle a much higher debt ratio than a smaller, less stable economy that borrows in, say, US dollars.
Oh, context really matters. It's about whether you can actually manage the debt load.
That's the key. It's about management and the underlying economic strength.
Okay, so given all this, could a country just decide, nope, no more debt? Could a country actually be completely 100% debt-free?
Theoretically, maybe. But in the real world today, no. There aren't any sovereign nations that have zero national debt. Every single one carries some.
Seriously, none at all. Not even like tiny rich countries.
Well, you sometimes hear Macau mentioned as being debt-free, but Macau is a special administrative region of China, not a fully independent country, and its economy is uniquely fueled by massive casino revenues. That's not a model most countries could replicate,
So for a regular country, it's basically impossible or impractical.
pretty much. And even if a country could somehow pay off every single dollar of debt, most probably wouldn't want to.
Why not? Wouldn't being debt-free be a good goal?
To get there, you'd likely need either absolutely massive cuts to government spending, which would hurt services and probably the economy, or huge, deeply unpopular tax hikes. Or both. It would likely cause significant economic pain and social disruption.
And didn't you say government bonds are actually important for the financial system?
Yes, that's the other side. Government bonds, especially from stable countries, are seen as ultra-safe investments.
Hmm.
Pension funds, insurance companies, banks, they rely on these bonds to manage their money safely. If government debt disappeared entirely, it would remove a foundational asset from the financial markets, potentially making them much more volatile and making it harder for institutions and even individuals to find safe places for long-term savings, like retirement funds.
Huh. So getting rid of debt entirely isn't necessarily desirable, even if it were possible.
For most modern economies, probably not. The goal isn't zero debt. It's sustainable debt. Managing it effectively, using it wisely when needed, and keeping it at a level the economy can support.
But when we see those huge debt numbers in the news, we shouldn't just panic. We need to think about how the debt is being used, who holds it, and whether the country can actually afford it long term.
Exactly. It's a tool. It can build things up, or if misused or allowed to grow unchecked, it can cause serious problems.
It really is complex. And thinking about how deeply embedded this system of national debt is in nearly every country, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who are the biggest winners in this system, and who ultimately bears the burden if things go wrong?
That's a profound question to ponder, absolutely.
Well, hopefully, walking through the basics, the what, why, and who of national debt has helped make this whole topic feel a little less overwhelming. It's not just abstract numbers. It's about real choices governments make that affect all of us.
What part of this discussion stood out most to you or maybe surprised you? We'd be really interested to hear your perspectives. Let us know down in the comments.
And hey, if you found this breakdown helpful and want to explore more topics like this, make sure you subscribe to Marginal Thoughts. Thanks so much for joining us today.